today's presentation is on the Armenian genocide, considered to be the first of the major genocides of the 20th century. And sadly, the 20th century is known as the century of genocide. When we look at genocides, we're going to look at a number of factors in order to explore the historical events. Some of the images in these presentations are problematic. They are disturbing. They're disgusting. What humans have done to each other, and frankly, the fact that people have taken pictures of what humans have done to one another. One of the other things we need to explore is, where is Armenia? While Armenia is one of the oldest nation states in the Western world, it was absorbed later into other nation states and empire states, particularly the Ottoman Empire, which was ruled by the dominant ethnic group known as the Turks, and they were Sunni Muslims, which is important to note because the Armenian people generally practice Orthodox Christianity. Armenia had not had defined borders over the centuries that it was part of the Ottoman Empire. That population of Armenians was dispersed throughout what we call Anatolia, which nowadays is really Turkey, and we're talking about the eastern half of Turkey, eastern Anatolia. That is where there were significant Armenian populations before the genocide. And you can see this as a heat map that shows the pre-genocide population of Armenians in Anatolia. Nowadays, we talk about Western Armenia and Eastern Armenia. Western Armenia is that area that we just looked at that had, before the genocide, a significant Armenian population. That has been absorbed into Turkey today. To the right, you can see the Republic of Armenia, which was established after World War I, became absorbed into the Soviet Union and was a puppet state of the USSR, and after 1989 became an independent country once more. And at that point, the tensions really flared up again between the Armenians and the Turks, as well as between the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis, who are also practicing Muslims. In each of the genocides we look at, we're going to talk about where that country is, as we just did. When was the genocide? Who were the perpetrators? Who were the victims? How and why was the genocide perpetrated? How did it end? And what were those ramifications for both the perpetrator populations as well as the victim populations? So let's begin. Armenia claims to be the oldest Christian country in the world, but as I said, it was later absorbed into other nation states and empire states. For about 400 years, it was part of the Ottoman Empire, which was multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multi-racial even, but there were increasing massacres of Armenian people in the 19th century with the rise of nationalism throughout Europe and the neighboring parts of North Africa, Southwest Asia, and Western Asia. The Armenian genocide occurred within the context of World War I. In World War I, remember, you have the Triple Entente, the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, all Christian countries, fighting against the Central Powers, Germany, Austro-Hungary, and the Ottoman empires. Often this is depicted as autocratic versus democratic wars, right? However, it's important to note that, again, the Turkish population was Sunni Muslim and the Armenian population was Orthodox Christian. So you have that dynamic factoring into the context of how these three pashas and Turkish nationals, known as the Young Turks, perceived the makeup demographically of the Ottoman Empire, as well as their fears of territorial loss, their fears of territorial loss to Armenian nationalism, their fears of losing World War I and being broken up by the dominant world powers. And so these three pashas used their offices to use the structures of government to orchestrate the Armenian genocide. The Armenian genocide is said to begin, this is the date that we use to signify the beginning of the genocide, as opposed to persecution or polarization or classification, any of those other stages of genocide, that really the extermination begins on April 24th, 1915. And this is the rounding up of the Armenian intelligentsia class, political leaders, religious leaders, secular leaders in academia or in the press and so forth. And it happened just days before the Allied landing at Gallipoli, because again, this is occurring in the context of World War I. So these Christian Armenian people were rounded up during the night and eliminated. And then if you think about it, under the stages of genocide and the strategy of genocide is with the elimination of the intelligentsia class, there was no leadership within the Armenian population to organize a moral or political or maybe even military resistance to the genocide. The arrests were ordered by one of the three pashas, and here we can see the faces of the men that were arrested, jailed, and later executed. Three pashas coordinated their activities with the Committee of Union and Progress, which had its special organization, a militia group, if you will, and it was led by Shakir, who was a pan-Turkish nationalist. One of the things that the Committee of Union and Progress supported was the opening of the jails in the Ottoman Empire. Murderers, thieves, thugs who were in jail were released from prison and organized by that Committee on Union and Progress to create these militia groups that started going through Anatolia, Eastern Anatolia in particular, and attacking Armenian villages and people. In addition, the Tensir Law was passed in May of 1915, which authorized the deportation of Armenians out of the Ottoman Empire, what we call forced migration in international law. So you have the deportation of the Armenian people out of their villages while their villages are under attack, and then those columns of refugees are also attacked by the so-called special organization. It's important to note that during the Armenian genocide, there was also what's known as the Greek genocide going on, as well as a third Assyrian genocide. So you have the deportation of Greek people of the Ottoman Empire out of Western Anatolia, and you have the deportation of Assyrian populations within the Ottoman Empire out of Central South Anatolia, and the deportation of Armenians out of the other population centers in Eastern Anatolia. That deportation order is followed up with this order of expropriation and confiscation, meaning that the property of those Armenians can now be legally taken by other people, whether these be the militia from the special organizations or other civilian populations of Muslim Turkish populations. So you see this polarization of pitting civilians against civilians, with the fact that the secular civilian population of Muslim Turks, neighbors, if you will, of these Armenians, are being encouraged to take property from their neighbors. People who used to shop together, live together, and recreate together are now being pitted against each other. Shakir, who I mentioned earlier, partnered with a man named Nazem, and these two used their medical training to support those extermination squads of thugs released from those Ottoman prisons. Before I advance to the next slide is very disturbing. Again, if you have sensitivity to images of people being hurt, please stop watching, please fast forward. It's disturbing. Those are human heads that are on poles. What is the value, if you will, of putting those heads on those sticks? Those people are dead already. What we see as patterns in genocide is it's not enough to kill people. It is the dehumanization of people up to the extermination, the dehumanization and the desecration of the bodies post-execution, and the dehumanization of survivors as well. Look at the picture in the bottom right-hand corner. Those are Armenian civilians being crucified. These thugs from the jails, these extermination squads, the special organization, they're attacking not just the civilian population of the Armenians, they're attacking their religion as well. And we have survivor stories, witnesses accounts of horses being used in multiple ways to perpetuate this genocide. horseshoes being heated up and nailed onto human bodies as a form of torture prior and in execution. One of the most disturbing things I've ever read about the Armenian genocide is that some of these squads would go into villages and they would separate the men, women, and children, and they would make the men dig holes in the ground up to about here. And then they would force the men to be buried into the ground. So the men's bodies are in the holes in the dirt with only their head sticking out. And then these extermination squads would hurt the children and the women, rape, violence, murder, while the men were in those dirt holes watching their family members being hurt. And then these extermination squads would ride their horses back and forth across the dirt over those heads of those male Armenians in the ground. These are the tools of genocide that were done by these thuggish extermination squads supported by the three pashas. In this picture, you can see an image of the squads coming in and separating those women and children and men. Here's one of the most disturbing pictures to me, because of the cavalierness, the way those men are just like standing there watching or not even watching. Like, there are dead human beings in front of you, sir. The man top left, but he's not looking at dead human bodies. He's having a casual conversation. In this picture, similarly, you see the naval officer in the Ottoman Navy center bottom who's looking at the camera while human beings are being executed right there in the square. And when we get to the phase of denial, how can we say the genocide didn't happen? The Turkish government's answer has always been that these were rogue actors doing this. Again, that's a uniformed member of the Ottoman military who is there in a square while civilians are being executed. It is the role of the law enforcement and the military to protect their civilian populations, isn't it? Starving children, holding up food, making children that are unclothed and hungry beg for food. And again, taking pictures of executions. And these are not random executions, right? When we look at the Rwandan genocide, this is organized to the point where they're taking the time to put up gallows and hang people when they could just swing a machete, if you will, or use a gun, right? There's a systematicness of this violence, which is even more disturbing in some ways. A village of Armenians with an Armenian religious leader standing by, trying to make sense of this act of violence. During World War I, the Russians were coming in from the northeast part of Anatolia at the same time as the French and the British were attacking the Germans on the Western Front. And so this Russian invasion of the Ottoman Empire from the northeast precipitated even more murder of Armenians, because the Russians were Orthodox Christians, the Armenians are Orthodox Christians, and to the Turkish nationals and the genocidarians, they were afraid of having a civilian population of Orthodox Christians behind the battle lines. They believed, or propaganda they preached, that the Armenians had to be eliminated because they would be a fifth column. Not all of the Armenians were murdered. As I said before, there's also forced migration. In this chart here, we can see the massacre circles, and the larger the circle, the more people were murdered in those villages. But you can also see the deportation lines. People fleeing to the Black Sea to get into Russia, people fleeing to Greece. When I think of the forced migration of the Armenians from 1915 to 1922, I can't help but also think of other forced migrations in history, like our very own in the United States, Trail of Tears, and the Indian Removal Act. What we see going on today in 2021 with the Rohingya people in Burma. Forced migration is a tool of genocide. Genocide is not just the mass killing of people. What was the role of the United States government during this? Well, here's Ambassador Henry Morgenthau, who was the ambassador of the United States to the Ottoman Empire, who documents in his letters back to the United States that the genocide is happening. The word genocide did not exist in 1915 and during World War I. It was coined later. But the words that he's using, death warrant, whole race, deportations, new method of massacre, that's why this course is known as genocide and the nameless crime. Because in the Armenian genocide, they didn't have words, they didn't have language to talk about the horrors of what was happening. What is the purpose of starving people that you're going to kill? What is the purpose of stripping them, cutting hair, rape? It's this idea of dehumanization that it's part of the psychology of it, we're told, has to do with removing guilt. That if you dehumanize, then it makes it easier to psychologically then exterminate. We estimate that between half and 2/3 of the pre-war, pre-genocide population of Armenians were exterminated, were murdered. Fortunately, some were able to survive through those forced migrations, through those deportations, and many escaped to the United States. The United States has a significant Armenian population. I'm from Rhode Island, and Rhode Island has per capita the highest Armenian population in the United States. There's a significant population of Armenians in California as well. And we have the multi-generational survivors of this horrible first genocide of the 20th century. While you've heard probably of the Treaty of Versailles, which is well known for ending World War I, there were other treaties in the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and the ending of World War I as well. One of those treaties that the United States participated in is the Treaty of Sèvres, which was signed between the Western powers and the Ottoman Empire. But the problem is that the Turkish nationals rejected the authority of the Ottoman Empire to negotiate and sign that treaty. Turkish nationalists overthrew their own Turkish Ottoman Empire to create the modern state of Turkey. In many ways, the Armenian genocide was a land grab of trying to preserve as much land for this new Turkey that was forming at the exclusion of other newly independent states, Armenia, Syria, Iraq, what becomes Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, and other places that in that dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. Here's an interesting map, and you can see the 1920 territorial divisions. And in particular, that bright light blue is what becomes Armenia after the war and gets absorbed into, as I said, a puppet state of the Soviet Union. And so that's what we call rump or smaller or lesser Armenia. And to the west or left of that, those yellow regions are the regions that were pre-war populated by significant numbers of civilian Armenians that were then either exterminated or deported. But as I said, the Turkish nationals and the new Turkish government did not accept that previous treaty. And so another treaty was signed 3 years later in which the United States, under the representation and leadership of U.S. Ambassador Mark Lambert Bristol, supported the Turkish position of defining those borders to the exclusion of those pre-war populations and really accepting the genocide of the Armenian people. Finally, the new Turkish government signed a population exchange agreement with Greece, which removed other Greek and, yes, some Armenian Christians from Western Anatolia. And that was the end of what is known as the Greco-Turkish War or the Greek genocide. in August of 1939, 6 years after the Nuremberg Codes have already begun what we call the show of the Holocaust, the German genocide, and just 1 month before the invasion of Poland, here's a quote from Adolf Hitler when he's talking about the pre-orders that he's given for that invasion of Poland, which starts World War I. And Adolf Hitler says, "I have issued the command. I'll have anybody who utters but one word of criticism executed. That our war aim does not consist of reaching certain lines, geography, if you will, but in the physical destruction of the enemy. Accordingly, I have placed my death head formations in readiness, for the present only in the East, with orders for them to send to death mercilessly and without compassion men, women, and children of Polish derivation and language, Lebensraum, what we call it later. Only thus shall we gain that living space which we need. Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" Adolf Hitler and the Holocaust were inspired by the lack of accountability to the Turkish people and the Turkish government for their responsibility for the Armenian genocide. And when you hear people deny the Armenian genocide today, remember that they're in agreement with Adolf Hitler, who's pointing out the denial himself. The denial of the Turkish people and the Turkish government is literally written into laws. Just as the modern state of Germany has laws that make it illegal to deny the Holocaust, the Turkish government today has laws on the book that make it a crime to admit that the genocide occurred. Article 301, Article 216, Article 323. You can go to jail, and there are people, there are academics and journalists who do go to jail. You can go to jail in Turkey in 2021. This culture of Turkish deniability, they got away with it in many ways because of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Because the United States wanted that backdoor access to threaten the Soviet Union by putting missiles in Turkey. So Turkey was allowed to almost negotiate their denial in exchange for their participation in NATO, the US military alliance. In their revision of history, the Turkish government and Turkish nationalist journalists and historians, they pose it as a question. What happened to the Armenian people? We're not sure what happened to the Armenian people. We were distracted and not paying attention because we were fighting World War I. That all of a sudden this almost 2 million population of human beings disappeared, and we're not really sure why. This is the so-called Armenian question, if you will. But we remember 1915. We know the Armenian genocide occurred. We know that it was the first genocide of this century of genocide. Look at all the countries in the world that have some governmental recognition of the genocide. And notice too, the two countries who officially do not recognize that genocide. But note that the United States is not the darkest shade of blue. That's because the national US government does not recognize the Armenian genocide. There are municipalities and there are states that have recognized it. The state of Colorado recently passed HB 2013-36, which mandates that public schools in Colorado teach the Armenian genocide. However, we have a history and a culture of the national government, particularly the presidents of the United States of both parties, ignoring the Armenian genocide. Now, under Ronald Reagan, and before Ronald Reagan, Turkey was a dictatorship. It was a military junta, essentially, that was established. And so, as a military junta, they didn't have to be sensitive to public opinion. So the Turkish government didn't mind the United States talking about the Armenian genocide. It was one of those deals where, okay, you can talk about the Armenian genocide in your politics in your country, but in our politics in our country of Turkey, we're going to deny it and ignore it and make it illegal to talk about it. We'll just both agree to ignore each other. However, during the 1980s, Turkey became a democratic republic. the military junta transitioned and allowed Turkey to be a democracy, one of the first Muslim democracies in the world. But as I said, that changes when Turkey becomes a democracy, because now the Turkish leaders are elected by the people and they're influenced by that pan-Turkish nationalism and that culture of denial. And so H.W. Bush, while running for president, said he would continue to acknowledge the Armenian genocide. But when he becomes president, he backs down and refuses to recognize the Armenian genocide. And it's not just him. President Clinton did the same thing. When running for president, he said, if elected president, I'll talk about the Armenian genocide. And then when he became president, all of a sudden it went away. And then in 2000, just before he walked out the door, he then tries to get the recognition passed through Congress and says that he'll sign it. And now at this point, the Turkish government starts lobbying the members of Congress to block that recognition. And I can't help but say I'm not very impressed that Bill Clinton was trying to push it in 2000 when he didn't push it from 1992 to 2000 when he was in office and having to work with the Turkish government. And sure enough, George W. Bush, he says when he's running for president, as governor of Texas, as he's running for president, he says, if I get elected, I'm going to talk about the Armenian genocide. And then he doesn't for 8 years. And you guessed it, in 2008, Senator Barack Obama, running for president, says, I quote, as president, I will recognize the Armenian genocide. It's as simple as that. And then for 8 years, President Obama did not recognize the Armenian genocide. Barack Obama was president in the centennial 100-year anniversary of the Armenian genocide and the murder of almost 2 million human beings, and did not recognize the Armenian genocide. In 2016, Hillary Clinton, as candidate, said if she was elected president, she would recognize the genocide. Donald Trump did not make any promises to recognize the genocide. He was elected president of the United States and for 4 years did not recognize the genocide either. And you guessed it. In 2020, Joe Biden said, I will recognize the Armenian genocide. It is currently March of 2021. Next month, we'll still be in class. We'll be able to watch the news. Next month will be another anniversary of the genocide. On April 24th, 2021, will the President of the United States, for the first time since Ronald Reagan, recognize the Armenian genocide? So to recap, the Armenian genocide occurred in the Ottoman Empire between the years 1915 and 1922. The perpetrators were Turkish nationalists led by the three pashas, but you also have those doctors, Shakir and Nazim. And the people on the streets doing the genocide were those thugs released from those Ottoman prisons, as I mentioned. The victims were Orthodox Christian Armenians. Why was this done? It was essentially a land grab. And how was it perpetuated? How was it enacted? Through extermination. We talked about the use of crucifixion as well as horses in the genocide, and as well as forced migration and deportation as an act of genocide. It finally ended with the success of the genocide. The land grab was successful. Eastern Anatolia, which was Armenian, is now Turkish. And that was codified in legislation through these treaties that wrapped up the agreements between the Western powers and the new Turkish Republic that rose from the ashes of the decrepit and disillusioned Ottoman Empire. The ramifications, again, most importantly, the ramifications for the perpetrators of the genocide was absolutely none. And we saw that quote by Adolf Hitler almost being inspired by that lack of accountability. And really the ramifications for the victims are that they've lost their country. We have the modern rump state of Armenia, which is really should be only Eastern Armenia, but that's all that's left. And we have the immigration of Armenians to the United States and a significant and healthy refugee population, 100 years of refugee-ness of Armenian Americans living with us today. And this is the eternal flame. This is the memorial to the murdered and deported victims of the Armenian genocide. It's in the capital of the rump state of Armenia today. It's 2021. Let's remember and acknowledge the Armenian genocide.